Coast Guard finds abandoned fishing boat. All radios are smashed, and dinner's still warm. The emergency beacon cut through the morning fog like a desperate cry for help. Lieutenant Sarachin gripped the radio as the signal crackled through the static. 3 short bursts, then silence. The Mirabelle's distress call had been their only communication in 12 hours, and now even that had gone dead. "There she is," called Petty Officer Martinez from the bow of the Coast Guard cutter. Through the lifting mist, the outline of a fishing boat emerged, bobbing gently on the calm Pacific swells. The Mirabelle sat eerily still, her nets trailing in the water like forgotten dreams. Chen felt her stomach tighten. In her 8 years with the Coast Guard, she'd seen plenty of maritime emergencies, but something about this one felt different. The boat wasn't listing or taking on water. No smoke rose from her stack. She just sat there, perfectly ordinary and completely wrong. "Ahoy, Mirabelle!" Martinez shouted through the bullhorn as they pulled alongside. His voice echoed across the water and died in the silence. No response. No movement on deck. Even the seagulls seemed to avoid the vessel, wheeling away whenever they came too close. Chen's team secured the boats together with practiced efficiency. The Mirabelle was a typical 30-footer, weathered blue hull, rust stains marking years of honest work, fishing gear arranged with the careful precision of men who depended on the sea for their living. Everything looked normal, except for the complete absence of life. "Ma'am," called Seaman Rodriguez from the wheelhouse, his voice tight with confusion. "You need to see this." Chen climbed aboard, her boots echoing hollowly on the deck. The first thing that struck her was the smell, not the usual mixture of fish, diesel, and salt air, but something else. Something that made her skin crawl without understanding why. In the wheelhouse, Rodriguez pointed to the radio console. The equipment had been systematically destroyed, not damaged by weather or accident, but deliberately smashed. Fragments of plastic and metal littered the floor, and the wiring had been yanked out with violent force. "Someone really didn't want anyone calling for help," Rodriguez observed. But it was the scene below deck that truly unsettled them. In the small galley, a plate of beans and rice sat on the worn formica table. Chen touched the ceramic rim gently, still warm. A half-empty coffee cup sat beside it, steam no longer rising but the liquid still hot enough to burn her finger. "This food was being eaten maybe 20 minutes ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is everyone?" Martinez appeared at the bottom of the narrow stairs, his face pale. "4 berths down here, all with personal belongings. Looks like the crew was planning to be out for several days." He held up a crumpled photograph, 3 men grinning at the camera, arms around each other's shoulders. "Captain Joe Reeves, his brother Tommy, and a kid named Danny Santos. Local guys, been fishing these waters for years." Chen examined the photo. The men looked happy, confident. These weren't amateurs or weekend warriors. They were professionals who knew every current and weather pattern in the region. They wouldn't just abandon their boat. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez called from the wheelhouse. "The ship's log ends right here." He pointed to an open logbook on the chart table. The last entry was dated yesterday at 2:47 p.m., weather holding steady. "Fish are running good. Making for the deep water." The handwriting was neat, unhurried. No sign of distress or panic. But tucked between the pages, Chen found something that made her blood run cold, a small piece of paper covered in symbols and numbers that made no sense. The writing was different from the log entries, more frantic, as if written in haste. "What do you make of this?" she asked Martinez, showing him the coded note. He studied it carefully, his weathered face creasing with concentration. "Could be coordinates, maybe. Or some kind of message. But why hide it in the log?" Chen pocketed the note and climbed back on deck. The afternoon sun was beginning to burn through the fog, revealing the vast emptiness of the Pacific stretching in all directions. No other boats were visible, no debris, no sign of struggle or distress. "Run a full search," she ordered. "Check every inch of this boat. Look for blood, signs of violence, anything that might tell us what happened here." As her team spread out across the Mirabelle, Chen stood at the bow and stared out at the endless water. The boat's engine was still warm, the fuel tanks nearly full. Personal belongings were arranged as if the crew had just stepped out for a moment. But 3 grown men didn't just vanish from a perfectly good boat in calm seas. The mystery deepened when they found the life preservers, all accounted for and properly stowed. The emergency flares were in use, the first aid kit untouched. Everything suggested the crew had left voluntarily, but that made no sense. Fishermen didn't abandon their boats, especially not with a hold full of ice and supplies for a week at sea. "Lieutenant," Martinez called from the stern. "You're going to want to see this." He was pointing at the water behind the boat, where something glinted just beneath the surface. Chen leaned over the rail and saw it, a diving mask, floating just out of reach. The glass was cracked, and dark stains that might have been blood marred the rubber seals. "Get the hook," she ordered, her voice steady despite the chill running down her spine. As they pulled the mask aboard, Chen noticed something else that made her pause. The Maribel's fish hold was empty, not just lacking a catch, but scrubbed clean. The ice was fresh, the compartments spotless. For a boat that had supposedly been fishing for 2 days, there was no sign they'd caught anything at all. What were they really doing out here? She wondered aloud. The coded note in her pocket seemed to burn with hidden meaning. 3 men, experienced fishermen who knew these waters like their own backyard, had deliberately smashed their radio, abandoned their boat, and vanished without a trace. The warm dinner suggested they'd left in a hurry, but why? As the Coast Guard cutter prepared to tow the Maribel back to port, Chen took one last look around the abandoned vessel. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the deck, and for a moment she could almost imagine she heard voices, the ghostly echo of conversations that had taken place just hours before. Whatever had happened to the crew of the Maribel, Chen was certain of one thing: they hadn't been victims of the sea. They'd been victims of something far more dangerous: human nature itself. The coded note in her pocket might hold the key to understanding what had driven 3 men to abandon everything they'd worked for, but she had a feeling that some secrets were better left buried beneath the waves. The mystery of the Maribel was just beginning, and Chen knew that before it was over, she'd wish she never pulled that diving mask from the water. Back at the Coast Guard station, Chen spread the contents of the Maribel across a conference table like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The coded note lay in the center, its cryptic symbols mocking her attempts to understand. She'd run it through every decryption program they had, but the message remained stubbornly silent. "What do you make of this?" she asked Chief Warrant Officer Blake, sliding a nautical chart across the table. Red circles marked fishing spots, but one location stood out, a large X drawn in heavy black ink, roughly 15 miles northwest of where they'd found the Maribel. Blake studied the chart with the weathered eyes of a man who'd spent 30 years reading the ocean's secrets. "That's deep water out there. Not a place you'd normally fish for anything commercial. Bottom's too rocky, currents are unpredictable." He tapped the X with his finger. "But if you were looking for something specific..." Chen felt a chill of recognition. "Something like what?" "Could be a wreck site. These waters have claimed plenty of boats over the years." She pulled out her laptop and began searching maritime records. Within minutes, she found what she was looking for: insurance reports, Coast Guard incident files, and newspaper clippings dating back decades. The area marked on the chart had a dark history. "Look at this," she said, turning the screen toward Blake. "The Esperanza, a cargo vessel that went down in 1987. Official cause was listed as storm damage, but there were rumors." Blake leaned in closer. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that suggests the Esperanza wasn't carrying legitimate cargo when she sank." Chen scrolled through more documents. DEA had been tracking suspected drug smuggling operations in the area around that time. The ship went down during a storm, but some of the crew survived. They claimed the captain had been acting strange, changing course without explanation, making unscheduled stops. "And you think our fishermen found her?" Chen held up the diving mask they'd recovered. "This isn't standard fishing gear. It's a professional diving mask, the kind used for deep water salvage operations." She pointed to additional evidence laid out on the table. Look what else we found in the Maribel's storage compartments. Blake examined the items she'd arranged: a waterproof metal detector, diving weights, underwater cutting tools, and most tellingly, a collection of maritime salvage guides and underwater archaeology manuals. Hidden beneath false bottoms in the storage lockers, these items told a story very different from a routine fishing expedition. They weren't fishing at all, Blake said, understanding dawning in his voice. No, they weren't. Chin opened the ship's log to earlier entries she'd missed during the initial search. Look at this pattern over the past 2 months. Captain Reeves has been taking the Maribel to the same general area repeatedly, but the fishing reports don't match the locations. He's been lying about where they were going. The evidence painted a clear picture. The crew had discovered something valuable on the ocean floor, something worth abandoning their legitimate fishing operation for. But Chin knew from experience that treasure hunters rarely worked alone, and secrets this big had a way of destroying the people who kept them. There's more, she said, pulling out a manila folder. I ran background checks on the crew. Danny Santos, the young deckhand, has a clean record, but he's been struggling financially. His mother needs expensive medical treatment, and he's been working double shifts to pay for it. Joe and Tommy Reeves have been fishing these waters for 20 years, but their business has been declining. Competition from larger commercial operations, environmental regulations, rising fuel costs. They were barely breaking even. Blake nodded grimly. Desperate men make desperate choices. Chin pulled out her phone and showed him photographs from the Maribel's cabin. I found these tucked inside Joe Reeves's bunk. The images showed crude sketches of what appeared to be ship blueprints, along with notes about cargo manifests and estimated values. They'd been planning this for months. But something went wrong, Blake observed. Very wrong. Chin opened the decoded version of the cryptic note they'd found. After hours of work, she'd finally cracked the simple substitution cipher. The message was brief but chilling. D knows. Cannot trust. Must act tonight. D has to be Danny Santos, she said. Someone in the crew was getting nervous about their illegal salvage operation. Maybe Danny was having second thoughts, or maybe he was planning to report them to the authorities. Blake studied the evidence with growing concern. So they destroyed the radio to prevent him from calling for help? That's what I think. But the question is, what happened next? Chin gathered the papers and charts, her mind racing through possibilities. 3 men went out on that boat, but only their equipment came back. Either they're all finished, or they're hiding somewhere, too afraid to come forward. She looked out the window at the harbor, where the Maribel sat tied to a Coast Guard dock like a piece of evidence in a crime that hadn't yet been fully understood. Somewhere out there, the Pacific held the answers to what had driven 3 men to abandon everything they'd built for a chance at underwater treasure. We need to check that wreck site, Chin said finally. Whatever the crew of the Maribel found down there, it was worth 4. The dive boat Resolute cut through the morning swells toward the coordinates marked on the Maribel's chart. Chin stood at the bow, watching the GPS coordinates tick closer to their destination. 15 miles northwest of the fishing boat's discovery, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface giving no hint of the secrets lying beneath. Depth here is about 200 feet, called Master Diver Petty Officer Jackson from the sonar console. And Lieutenant, you're going to want to see this. Chin hurried to the screen, where the ghostly outline of a large vessel emerged from the digital shadows. The Esperanza lay broken on the ocean floor, her hull split open like a giant's discarded toy. But what caught Chen's attention wasn't the wreck itself, it was the evidence of recent activity around it. Look at these disturbance patterns. Jackson pointed to areas where the sandy bottom had been churned up. Someone's been working this site, and recently. See these tool marks on the hull? Fresh cuts, probably made with underwater torches. Chin felt her pulse quicken. How recently? Days, maybe a week at most. The sand hasn't had time to settle back. Within an hour, Chin found herself descending into the blue-green darkness, her diving light cutting through the water like a sword. The Esperanza materialized slowly from the gloom, larger than she'd expected and far more ominous. The cargo ship's hull was twisted and broken, creating caverns of shadow where anything might be hiding. But it was the evidence of the Mirabelle's crew that made her blood run cold. Diving equipment lay scattered around the wreck, extra air tanks, cutting tools, and a waterproof bag containing what looked like detailed salvage plans. The crew had been methodical, professional, and utterly focused on their goal. Jackson's voice crackled through her diving communicator. "Lieutenant, you need to see what's inside the cargo hold." Chen swam toward the gaping hole in the ship's side, her light revealing the twisted remains of the Esperanza's final voyage. But the cargo hold wasn't empty as she'd expected. Instead, she found herself staring at something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the case. The hold was filled with wooden crates, many of them broken open and their contents scattered across the floor. But these weren't the drugs or weapons she'd expected to find. Instead, the crates contained artifacts, gold coins, silver jewelry, ceramic vessels, and religious items that looked centuries old. The Esperanza hadn't been smuggling drugs, she'd been carrying stolen antiquities. "This is incredible." Jackson's voice was filled with awe. "These artifacts look pre-Columbian, maybe Aztec or Maya. This collection would be worth millions on the black market." Chen examined the scattered treasures, her mind racing. The crew of the Mirabelle had stumbled onto something far more valuable than they'd ever imagined. But as she explored deeper into the wreck, she found evidence that their discovery had come at a terrible price. In what had once been the ship's quarters, she discovered a waterproof notebook wrapped in plastic. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in different scripts: Joe Reeves's careful block letters, Tommy's hurried scrawl, and Danny Santos's neat cursive. But it was the progression of entries that told the real story. The first entries were excited, almost childlike in their enthusiasm. "Found something amazing. Could set us up for life. Nobody needs to know." But as the days passed, the tone changed. Suspicion crept in, then paranoia, then outright fear. Danny's final entry was dated just 2 days ago. "They don't trust me anymore. Joe keeps watching me, and Tommy won't let me use the radio. They think I'm going to turn them in. Maybe they're right. This feels wrong. Mom needs that money, but not like this. Not stolen from people who died centuries ago." Joe's response was written in angry, jagged letters. "Boy doesn't understand what we've got here. This is our chance. Been fishing these waters for 20 years, barely scraping by while the big companies take everything. We deserve this. But if he can't keep his mouth shut..." The notebook ended there, but Chen found one more piece of evidence that made her stomach turn. Tucked between the pages was a photograph, the same one they'd found on the Mirabelle, showing the 3 men with their arms around each other. But this copy had been torn, separating Danny from the other 2 men. "Lieutenant," Jackson's voice was tense, "I've found something else. There's a section of the wreck that's been recently disturbed. Looks like they tried to seal off one of the cargo holds." Chen swam toward the area Jackson had indicated, her light revealing fresh welding marks on twisted metal. Someone had worked frantically to close off access to this part of the ship, but their work was incomplete. Through a gap in the makeshift barrier, she could see into the sealed compartment. Inside, scattered among more broken crates of artifacts, lay something that made her blood freeze. Personal effects, a wallet, a watch, and a diving mask similar to the one they'd found floating near the Mirabelle. But these items were arranged too carefully, too deliberately. "Jackson," she called, her voice steady despite the horror of her realization. "We need to surface. Now." As they ascended through the darkening water, Chen's mind raced through the implications of what she'd found. The crew of the Mirabelle had discovered a treasure beyond their wildest dreams, but greed and fear had transformed their partnership into something deadly. Danny Santos's conscience had made him a liability, and his crewmates had decided that some secrets were worth 4. But the question that haunted Chen as they broke the surface was this: if Danny was finished, sealed in the wreck below, then who had been eating that warm dinner on the Mirabelle? And where were Joe and Tommy Reeves now? Chen spread the evidence across the conference table like a prosecutor building a case. The waterproof notebook from the Esperanza lay open beside enlarged photographs of the wreck site, each piece of evidence painting a darker picture of what had happened aboard the Maribel. "Let me walk you through what I think happened," she said to Blake and the assembled team. The Reeves brothers and Danny Santos had been salvaging artifacts from the Esperanza for weeks. Everything was going smoothly until Danny's conscience started eating at him. She pointed to the notebook entries. "Look at the timeline. 3 days ago, Danny writes about feeling guilty. 2 days ago, he's talking about turning them in. And the day before we found the Maribel, Joe Reeves writes about Danny being a liability." Blake studied the evidence with growing concern. "So they decided to eliminate him?" "I think they planned to. But Danny wasn't stupid. He knew he was in danger." Chen pulled out a piece of evidence that had been bothering her since the dive. "We found this wedged under one of the diving tanks at the wreck site." She held up a small waterproof pouch containing a cell phone. The screen was cracked but still functional, and when she powered it on, a series of text messages appeared. "Danny had been trying to contact someone," she explained. "Look at these messages, sent the night before we found the boat." The text told a desperate story. "Mom, if something happens to me, call the Coast Guard. Tell them about the Esperanza. I know what I have to do. This is bigger than just us. They don't trust me anymore. Joe keeps watching me. I think they're planning something. I'm going to call for help tonight. I can't let this continue." Blake whistled low. So Danny was planning to turn them in, and they knew it. "Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting." Chen pulled up the Maribel's communication logs. "We found fragments of the radio equipment, and I had the electronics team analyze them. The radios weren't just smashed, they were sabotaged systematically, one by one, over the course of several hours." She showed them a detailed analysis of the damage. "This wasn't done in a moment of panic. Someone took their time, making sure every piece of communication equipment was destroyed. They wanted to make sure Danny couldn't call for help." "But why leave the boat?" Blake asked. "If they'd eliminated Danny, why not just continue their operation?" Chen's expression darkened. "Because something went wrong. Look at this." She pulled out a new piece of evidence, a diving log they'd found sealed in another waterproof container. "According to this, Danny was supposed to make a night dive to the wreck on the evening before we found the boat. He never came back up." The log entries, written in Joe Reeves's handwriting, told a chilling story. 11:30 p.m. Danny went down to check the sealed compartment. Should be back in 45 minutes. 12:45 a.m. Danny's been down too long. Tommy's getting worried. 1:30 a.m. still no sign of Danny. His air would be running low. 2:15 a.m. found his emergency line cut. Someone cut it from below. 2:30 a.m. Tommy's panicking. Says Danny must have done it himself to fake his death. But I know better. Chen paused, letting the implications sink in. Danny didn't disappear accidentally. Someone cut his emergency line while he was trapped inside the wreck. But here's the twist, Joe thought Tommy did it, and Tommy thought Joe did it. Blake stared at the evidence in horror. They turn on each other? The paranoia that made them distrust Danny spread to each other. Look at the final entries. Chen pointed to increasingly frantic handwriting. Joe writes, Tommy's been acting strange. Keeps asking about Danny's share of the artifacts. I think he planned this all along. And Tommy's response, written in different ink, Joe's lying. He's the one who wanted Danny gone. Now he's trying to pin it on me. Can't trust him anymore. Chen pulled out the final piece of evidence. A blood-stained diving knife found in the Maribel's galley. We found this hidden in the kitchen. DNA analysis shows blood from at least 2 different people. There was a fight aboard that boat. So what happened to them? Blake asked. I think they fought, both of them injured, both of them terrified. They realized they couldn't go back to port. Too many questions, too much evidence. And they couldn't stay on the boat together without finishing each other. Chen pointed to the chart. So they took the emergency lifeboat and ran. She traced a likely route on the nautical chart. Currents would have carried them northeast, toward the Channel Islands. If they survived the night, they could have made it to one of the smaller islands, but they'd be stranded there. Blake nodded grimly. A pair of injured, paranoid men with a fortune in stolen artifacts and nowhere to run. But here's what really bothers me, Chen continued. We found evidence that someone was still aboard the Mirabelle after the fight. That warm dinner, the coffee that was still hot, someone was eating when we arrived. She pulled out a final photograph from the boat's galley. Look at this place setting. One plate, one cup, one set of utensils. Whoever was eating wasn't sharing with anyone else. The implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Either Joe or Tommy Reeves had survived their confrontation, and they were still out there somewhere, carrying the weight of two finishing and a treasure that had cost them everything. We need to find that lifeboat, Chen said finally. And we need to find it fast. Because whoever's still alive is desperate, armed, and has nothing left to lose. The call came 3 days later, just as Chen was beginning to fear they'd never find the missing crew member. A park ranger on San Miguel Island had spotted an overturned lifeboat washed up on the rocky shoreline, and smoke rising from the island's interior suggested someone was still alive. Chen's helicopter swept low over the rugged landscape, scanning for signs of life. San Miguel was a desolate place, 25 square miles of windswept hills and isolated beaches where a person could hide indefinitely. But the smoke was a beacon, and as they followed it inland, Chen spotted a figure huddled beside a small fire. There, she called to the pilot. Set us down on that ridge. The man looked up as the helicopter approached, his face a mask of exhaustion and fear. Chen recognized him immediately from the photograph. Tommy Reeves, the younger brother, his clothes torn and stained with salt and what looked like dried blood. He made no attempt to run as Chen and her team approached, just sat beside his meager fire like a man who'd given up all hope. Tommy Reeves? Chen called out, her hand resting on her sidearm. Coast Guard. We need to talk. Tommy looked up with hollow eyes that seemed to have aged decades in just a few days. I figured you'd find me eventually, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Guess it's time to pay the piper. Chen motioned for her team to take positions around the campsite while she approached cautiously. Tommy appeared unarmed, but desperation could make even a broken man dangerous. Where's your brother, Tommy? Where's Joe? A bitter laugh escaped Tommy's lips. Joe? Joe's feeding the fish about 10 miles south of here. Has been for 2 days now. He gestured toward the overturned lifeboat. Boat capsized in the surf. I made it to shore. He didn't. Chen studied his face, looking for signs of deception. Tell me what happened on the Mirabelle. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if he could see the past dancing in the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. It started out so simple. We found that old wreck, saw all that treasure just sitting there. Figured nobody would miss it, ship's been down for 30 years. We could take a little at a time, sell it quiet-like, and finally have something to show for all those years of busting our backs. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire. Danny was nervous from the start. Kid had principles, you know? Kept talking about how it wasn't right, how we were stealing from history. But his mama needed that cancer treatment, and we needed the money too. Fishing ain't been good for years. So you convinced him to stay quiet? For a while. But Danny, he couldn't handle the guilt. Started talking about coming clean, about turning us in. Tommy's voice hardened. That's when Joe got scared. Said we'd all go to prison, lose everything. Said maybe Danny needed to have an accident. Chen felt her stomach tighten. Did you finish Danny Santos? Tommy's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. No. That's what Joe thought, but I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't touch that boy. Danny went down to the wreck that night, just like always. But something went wrong down there. His airline got tangled, maybe cut on some sharp metal. By the time we realized he was in trouble, it was too late. But Joe didn't believe you? Joe went crazy after we lost Danny. Started accusing me of planning it, said I wanted Danny's share of the treasure. We fought about it for hours. He smashed the radios so I couldn't call for help, said we had to stick together now or we'd both go down. Tommy's voice broke. But I knew he was planning to finish me. Saw it in his eyes. Same look he got when he talked about Danny. Chin leaned forward. So you fought him? Had to. It was him or me. Tommy rolled up his sleeve, revealing a deep gash along his forearm. He came at me with a knife. We wrestled for it, and he fell. Hit his head on the corner of the galley table. Blood everywhere. The pieces were falling into place. But Joe didn't die immediately? No. He was hurt bad, but still breathing. I thought about calling for help, but the radios were destroyed. I got him to the lifeboat, figured I could get him to a hospital. Tommy's voice became bitter. Funny thing is, he was conscious enough to keep accusing me. Even bleeding and half-finished, he kept saying I'd planned it all along. Chin could picture the scene. 2 desperate men, both injured, both convinced the other was a criminal, trying to survive in a small boat on the open ocean. What happened to the treasure? Tommy laughed bitterly. You mean the stuff that cost us everything? Joe threw it overboard during the fight. Said if he couldn't have it, nobody could. 30 years of artifacts, worth millions, sitting on the bottom of the ocean again. But you kept some of it? Tommy reached into his jacket and pulled out a small jade figurine, its surface carved with intricate Mayan symbols. Just this. Figured I'd earned it after what I'd been through. But looking at it now, he held it up to the firelight. It's just a piece of stone. Not worth dying for. Not worth for. He tossed the figurine to Chin. Danny was right all along. We should have left it alone. Should have just been fishermen, earned our living honest. But we got greedy, and greed makes monsters out of ordinary men. Chin caught the artifact, feeling the weight of centuries in her hands. Tommy Reeves, you're under arrest for the theft of maritime artifacts and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. As she read him his rights, Tommy just nodded wearily. I know I got to pay for what I did. But I want you to know, I never meant for any of this to happen. We were just 3 guys trying to make a living, and we found something that was too big for us to handle. He looked out at the ocean, where the afternoon sun was beginning to set. Funny thing is, I'd give anything to go back to just being a fisherman. Even if it meant being poor for the rest of my life. 6 months later, Chin stood on the dock watching the Maribel being loaded onto a transport truck. The once proud fishing boat looked smaller somehow, stripped of its mystique and reduced to what it had always been, 30 feet of weathered fiberglass and faded dreams. A sign attached to the truck read, Salvage Yard 4 parts, and Chin couldn't help but think it was a fitting end. The case had been closed with surprising little fanfare. Tommy Reeves had pled guilty to theft of archaeological artifacts and obstruction of justice, receiving a 5-year sentence that would likely be reduced to 3 with good behavior. The judge had been lenient, recognizing that greed and desperation had driven ordinary men to extraordinary crimes. You look like you're attending a funeral, Blake said, joining her on the dock. In a way I am, Chin replied. 3 men went out on that boat 6 months ago. Danny Santos is buried in Riverside Cemetery, his medical bills finally paid by a Coast Guard relief fund. Joe Reeves's body was never recovered. And Tommy's sitting in Terminal Island, probably wishing he'd never heard of the Esperanza. Blake nodded grimly. What about the artifacts? Chin held up a thick folder. The Smithsonian's Maritime Archaeological Division took custody of what we recovered. Turns out the collection was worth more than we thought, over $8 million. Pre-Columbian pieces that were stolen from a museum in Guatemala back in 1987. The Esperanza wasn't just smuggling drugs, she was carrying stolen cultural treasures. And they all ended up back on the ocean floor? Most of them. Joe threw the majority overboard during his fight with Tommy. Our dive teams recovered about 20% of the original haul, but the rest is scattered across 50 square miles of seafloor. Chin closed the folder. The Guatemalan officials has requested that we leave the remaining artifacts where they are. They say the ocean is a better guardian than any museum. Blake watched as the truck carrying the Maribel disappeared into traffic. Hard to believe all that death and destruction came from some old pottery and gold trinkets. It wasn't really about the treasure, Chin said thoughtfully. It was about desperation. Danny Santos needed money for his mother's cancer treatment. The Reeves brothers were losing their fishing business to corporate competition. They saw that treasure as their only way out of poverty. She pulled out a letter from her jacket. Danny's mother wrote to me last week. She wanted to thank the Coast Guard for finding out what happened to her son. Said knowing the truth was worth more than any treasure. Did you tell her about Danny's final decision? About how he was going to turn them in? Chin smiled sadly. I told her that her son died trying to do the right thing. Sometimes that's all the closure a family can get. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the harbor, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. Chin had worked dozens of maritime cases over the years, but this one had stayed with her in ways she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the ordinariness of the men involved, or the way their story could have been anyone's story given the right circumstances. You know what bothers me most? Chin said finally. They could have done it legally. Contacted the proper authorities, reported the wreck, worked with archaeologists to recover the artifacts properly. There would have been finder's fees, maybe even jobs with the recovery team. But they were so desperate, so afraid of losing their chance, that they never considered the honest path. Blake kicked at a piece of rope lying on the dock. Fear makes people do stupid things. No, Chin corrected him. Fear makes people do desperate things. Greed makes them do stupid things. The combination is deadly. A seagull landed on the pier railing and cocked its head at them, as if waiting for an explanation of human nature that would never come. In the distance, another fishing boat was heading out for the evening catch, its crew probably dreaming of full nets and fair weather. Chin wondered if any of them had heard the story of the Maribel. She hoped they had. She hoped they understood that some treasures came with a price too high to pay, and that the ocean kept its own accounting of human folly. Come on, Blake said, starting back toward the station. Paperwork won't file itself. Chin took one last look at the harbor, then followed him inside. The Maribel was gone, heading for a scrapyard where she'd be stripped for parts and memories. Tommy Reeves was serving his time, learning that prison walls were just another kind of cage for men who'd already imprisoned themselves with guilt and regret. The Pacific would keep its secrets, as it always had. Somewhere beneath the waves, the Esperanza continued her eternal watch over treasures that had cost more lives than they were worth. The ocean had claimed 4 men in the end, the original crew of the smuggling vessel, and 3 fishermen who'd thought they could cheat death and consequences. But Chin knew the real tragedy wasn't the lost lives or even the scattered treasure. It was the simple fact that 3 ordinary men had been destroyed not by storms or sea monsters, but by the oldest curse of all, the belief that wealth could solve problems that only character could address. The sea would remember their story long after the last court document was filed and the last news article was forgotten. It always did.